Hi. We continue in Luke 7 today with the wonderful story of Jesus dining at the house of Simon the Pharisee and being treated with extravagant and astounding love by somebody called a woman of the city, a sinner. I love this story for many reasons, and just to underscore the radicality of this story, imagine a similar story set in two different contexts in our world today. An evangelical megachurch is having a church supper, and into that supper a trans person walks up and falls at the feet of the pastor and begins crying and washing the feet of the pastor and kissing those feet with their hair. Imagine on the other side, imagine a liberal, open and affirming congregation, Catholic or Protestant. I guess they have to be Protestant, but we won't get into that detail here. And someone known as a blatant racist or anti-Semite comes in and throws themselves at the feet of the pastor and begins crying and wiping the pastor's feet. How would you respond in either of those circumstances? Wouldn't anybody be completely outraged? One of the most amazing things of the story is that Simon the Pharisee stays so quiet in the face of the astoundingly outrageous behavior of this woman and Jesus' acceptance of it. So perhaps one of the challenges in scholarship is that people haven't been amazed enough at the outrageousness of this story. And yet it comes with many presuppositions that suggest that many scholars, especially male scholars from the past, have been reading the story through the lens, ironically, of Simon, asking what kind of woman is this, deciding she's a prostitute, and then starting from there. But as we'll see, nothing in the story supports that. That's nothing but a complete misreading from the sexism and false cultural assumptions of many patriarchal interpreters themselves. So before we jump into it, let's situate ourselves in our context here. You can see on the right side of the screen, our story here takes place as one of the second examples of forms of resistance to trusting in Jesus and his way. And this section, as we've seen, is framed by these two pairs of stories, each with a man and a woman, a man of high status and a woman of low status, and these various other things that connect those stories that frame this unit. So we looked at great length at the one of John the Baptist's question, which is common to Matthew. And now we're looking at one that's unique to Luke, and that'll continue into the next scene. And we're not going to look at this in just one scene here, in one video, because there's a lot going on in this scene. So let's also situate it in the context of meal scenes. This is the second major meal scene in Luke's gospel, and we saw the first one was at the house of a tax collector. And we saw precisely there the Pharisees and the scribes, not the lawyers, as in the last scene we were at just before our current scene, who are implicitly challenged by the narrator and then by Jesus in his little parable about the children in the marketplace. And we saw that that last scene of John the Baptist and Jesus following up by challenging the crowd echoed this scene a lot. So now we get to the second of these scenes, and as I note here, and this is already posted on the webpage, so you can find it there, the first 5 of these 8 meal scenes form a rough chiasm connected by the Greek doken for great banquet, as we see in these two. And so now we're at this one, and the intersections, or the B sections, are the houses of a Pharisee. And then these will be followed later by these, and the last one, the 8th one, on the day of new creation in Emmaus. I referred last time to the Pharisees in Luke because the narrator had mentioned Pharisees, even though they weren't directly in the story. But they couldn't have been too far away, as we'll see in just a minute. So they were mentioned here along with the lawyers. This is who their companions are. Here it's just Simon the Pharisee, and there are other people at the table, obviously, but we don't know who those are. And so we don't hear that there's any companions. And so in this section here, we're seeing the Pharisees standing out. But remember, the Pharisees were the relative liberals, and that's why in my initial hypothetical about an open and affirming church, that's actually the more likely one to fit this story than the one of the more conservative evangelical megachurch concerned about LGBTQ issues. Because the Pharisees were the ones that were the next closest to Jesus in challenging the more rigid views of the Sadducees and the upholders of the temple way by creating an opportunity through their so-called oral Torah, oral law, that the home could become a place of holiness. And so we're in the Pharisees' house here, an alternative site to the temple, and this scene unfolds in this shocking way. As a unique scene to Luke, it uses a number, this one here, a number of words that are unique to Luke or almost unique to Luke. So we'll see some of those as we go, but I just want to highlight that throughout this scene we see words that are only in a few other places in Luke or elsewhere. And I note also there's a strange connection with John's story of the Mary of Bethany's anointing in John 11. There's our strange connection between Luke and John. You know, we think of Luke as one of the 3 synoptic gospels along with Mark and Matthew, and we certainly associate associate Matthew and Luke together through the supposed source Q that expresses what they have in common that's not in Mark. But there are several things that are echoes between Luke and John in a curious way, and this is one of them with this anointing scene, although in their terms of their narrative context, where each evangelist puts the story, they're very different. And of course, in John's story, we know exactly who's doing it. It's Mary of Bethany, the sister of Mary of Bethany, sister of Martha of Bethany. And curiously, Luke also has a Mary and Martha in chapter 10, and also has a Lazarus, not described as Mary and Martha's brother as he is in John 11, but as a poor man at the gate of the rich man in chapter 12 in Luke. So what those connections are between Luke and John, I don't know. I don't know any scholar that knows, but there they are. And we're not going to look at our whole story today, but I wanted to show you the whole thing with a little color coding so we could see some of the pattern of what Luke's working with here in shaping this story. Notice how in the red we're referring to the host. And in the whole first part, he's anonymous, simply the Pharisee. And as we'll see in a moment, naming it 3 times in the first couple of verses, indicating the dominant presence of Pharisee. But when Jesus speaks up, he's Simon, both in the mouth of Jesus and in the mouth of the narrator, as we see in both cases. So he stops being a Pharisee and becomes simply a human being. Note in the blue, which is describing the woman from the perspective of the narrator, from the perspective of Simon, from the perspective of Jesus. Then in the green, we see what she did, but especially the emphasis on feet. And I could have just highlighted feet, but I wanted to also highlight what's being done to his feet. And how utterly outrageous this is. Bathing his feet with her tears and drying them with her hair, and continued kissing his feet and anointing them. And Jesus says it later, she has not stopped kissing my feet since the time I came in. Anointed my feet with ointment. Narratively, we don't need this repetition. We already saw it. And yet the fact that he adds, in speaking to Simon, you gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her hair, really is highlighting feet, 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 feet. And one of the great ironies of the highlighting of feet, as we'll see, is feet are a plain biblical euphemism for male genitals, and there's something obviously erotic about this. Even if feet weren't a euphemism for genitals, can you men out there imagine what it would be like to have a woman come up to you and be touching your feet that way and kissing them continuously and wiping them with ointment? Tell me that's not an erotic moment there. But it's not, because she's a prostitute, which shows some of the irony, as we'll see, that scholars have often read the story through the lens of the Pharisee Simon's view rather than the lens of Jesus' view. So just a few things to get us going to the story. In addition, let's look a little bit at traditional art about this, because it also tells us something interesting here too. So first, this one from Jean Barreau from the late 19th century. And it's key, it's highlighting Mary Magdalene anoints the feet of Jesus at the house of Simon the Pharisee, which highlights the double sexism going on. I'm not blaming the artist, it was traditional at his time. But first of all, it's plainly not Mary Magdalene, it's just a woman in the city, and we'll look at that in a moment. But Mary Magdalene wasn't a prostitute either, but she's associated with that, even though nothing in the New Testament ever says that. The closest we have is in Luke, where it describes that Jesus cast out 7 demons from her, but that could mean anything. And so these assumptions that these women who are close to Jesus must be prostitutes, and because Jesus is associated with eating of the prostitutes, is just pure sexism and false cultural assumptions from male authors. And fortunately, more recent scholars, including a man, Charles Cosgrove, and women, feminist women especially, who followed him, have given us a fresh lens on looking at this story. To look at more positive art, let's look at this one from Rubens, who shows you something more of what the poignancy of, and you can see, I think, in the relationship between the woman and Jesus there, the intimacy and the eroticism of it, even though in that time period one wouldn't make that as blatant as one might in today's world. So let's go back and look at the narrative continuity here. And as I was showing last time, when our narrator here back in verses 30 highlighted that the Pharisees and the lawyers who were at issue in Jesus' contrast between those who do not accept John, who comes not eating and drinking, and those who refuse Jesus, who does come eating and drinking, that here we have a scene at a Pharisee's house. And astoundingly, some older scholars, including someone like a esteemed scholar like Joseph Fitzmyer, the author of the Anchor Bible on Luke, sees no connection between this story and what precedes it all. But I think we can see, as many more recent writers have, tight connections, not only the mention of the Pharisee, but the mention of eating and who you eat with and whether or not you eat or whether you fast as being one of the key issues of why the Pharisees aren't taking a stand either for or against John or against Jesus. So a tight connection between this story and what preceded, and more, as we'll see. So one of the Pharisees, again not named, but noting he's part of a group, representative of Pharisees, to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. The into the house expresses a link for a number of these meal scenes, which just highlights that Jesus is going into the Pharisees' territory, and certainly can expect that there'd be fellow Pharisees and others at the table. And the word for took his place at the table is one of these rare words that I highlighted before. Then we get to this infamous description that scholars assume means a prostitute, a woman in the city. But why? There's nothing in the ancient world's language resources that we know that this is somehow a euphemism, the way we have many an English streetwalker or whatever else for referring to someone who is a sex worker. But there's nothing to associate that. So we move into the description the narrator provides for this woman, and let's look closely what's actually said and not said and what we can understand from this. So the and here is kaidu, and behold, so the narrator is drawing attention to this startling event. This woman of the city comes uninvited into this house carrying this jar of ointment and begins her behavior. And many scholars have noted, especially in more recent years, that in Greek writing, especially stories around the symposium, the sense of gathering around a meal with other fellow citizens, especially among the elite, in those stories there's often a stock figure of the uninvited guest whose presence disrupts the meal and creates all kinds of adventure and havoc. And so people wanting to read this through the lens of Luke appealing to the familiar forms that would be known to his Greco-Roman young adult audience might well see, this is one of those uninvited guests who's going to disrupt the meal. But despite her behavior, the meal is curiously not disrupted at all. And so we see this description, a woman in the city here, and I'd suggest that that's simply saying she's from Nain. As my note says below, that's where they were in when the disciples of John the Baptist came to him. They just left Nain after the widow's son rose from the dead, and there's no reason to think they're anywhere else. In addition to that, one of my notes down here highlights how, from Bashaw here, that the woman's introduction to this narrative is trapped rhetorically on both sides by the imposing Pharisee's house. So Pharisee's house and Pharisee's house here. But we also note there that 827, which is also part of our wider section, the story in Gerasa, we see this. As Jesus, stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. And nobody, as far as I know, reads that passage and says the fact that he's a man of the city tells us something about him, like his profession or what kind of person he is. He's simply a man from the city who's out there in the country. And so there's no reason to think this is any more than a woman of the city. The only other factor that leads us to some scholars to read it through the lens of Simon is her downed hair, but we'll look at that in a minute when we get there. So, a woman of the city who was, or used to be perhaps. The Greek ain here, from the verb eimi, to be, is imperfect, suggested, as some scholars have said, used to be a sinner. And that will fit, as we'll see, with the sense that she already has a sense of being forgiven, or she wouldn't have come to Jesus with her tears. Notice the word sinner we heard earlier in chapter 5, the echoing scene in the previous meal scene when the question of eating with sinners, like the tax collectors and sinners. And we see it quite a number of times as we go. The woman having learned, we don't know how that came to be, or having come to know, whether that's a word on the street or somewhere else. She might have just seen it otherwise, because he went apparently from talking to the crowd to going into the Pharisee's house. The narrator doesn't suggest anything in between. But somehow she finds out that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, or literally lying at table in the Pharisee's house. And she brought an alabaster jar of myrrh. And here's what a Roman alabastron looks like, at least one from the ancient world, and what myrrh looked like here, both in its rocky form, hardened form, and in its liquid form. And we don't hear how much, and notice that Luke doesn't say how much its value is. That's not the emphasis here. As in the John version, chapter 11, when Judas objects that it could have been sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor, where the focus was on the lying nature and the greedy nature of Judas. But here the focus is not on the money, but on the love, as we'll see. And then we get to this key verse, verse 38, and every detail of it is worth pausing on because it's so astounding, and even if we've heard it 100 times, I invite you just to listen carefully to visualize how astounding this is. She stood behind him, literally stood behind, and note in my note here, in contrast to the elaborate notice of Jesus' entrance and reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, the woman's entry is veiled behind her actions. The description presumes that Jesus has turned away from the table and guessed to face her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have access to his feet. right? Because she couldn't have done that from behind without that kind of access. So she stood behind at his feet, weeping, and we've seen earlier weeping, and of course that's recalling both those who weep will be consoled, but also the weeping we saw in the scene of the mother's dead son, and began to bathe his feet. In the aorist tense, suggesting a process that began after she took her stand, to bathe his feet, literally to rain tears on his feet. And with her, and this is astounding. Can we imagine someone crying so much that the tear water covers his feet and requires drying with her hair? Just astounding scene here. And as I was saying at the beginning, it's amazing that the Pharisees and the others don't just jump out of their reclining position in outrage and just call their attendants to get her out of there. So they're expressing great tolerance to just allow this to happen at one level. Literally, the phrase here is the hairs of his head, the hairs of her head. And Green notes, and we'll see other views in this in a minute, letting her hair down in this setting would have been on a par with appearing topless in public. And that's based on the idea that a woman with her hair down was either a prostitute or noting publicly that she was sexually available. So, Charles Cosgrove, in his 2005 article on this, highlights how the assumptions of many scholars up until that time, that hair down meant prostitution or some kind of erotic invitation, it was just simply wrong. There's just not evidence to support that. And he reviews the evidence in detail and reaches these four possibilities that I'll put on the screen here so you can see. So he says, the typical woman's style throughout many centuries was to wear their hair long, but to bind it in some way so it did not hang down loosely. And that's the norm. But unbound hair often did have sexual connotations, and he gives the example of Medusa's seduction to Poseidon, or in the Christian shepherd of Hermas. But he also notes it can mean acts of thankful veneration, as in the Greek novel Kyrie and Kellerho, a popular Greek novel, or in Matthew 28:9 about holding feet. Note the artistic tradition of Aphrodite Venus rising from the sea, wringing her wet hair, and here are a couple examples of it, both a modern recreation of it and examples of it from the ancient world. So you can see there that in the Greek world, one of the chief gods, and certainly the god of love here, is seen as not embarrassed about swimming naked or coming out of the water with long wet hair. There also could be an expression of women warriors who often had free-flowing hair, symbolizing wildness or fierceness. But in addition to that, he concludes it can also be an expression of grieving. That to have the hair down or in disarray can be an expression of one isn't taking the time and trouble to put one's hair up, much like fasting can be an expression of grieving. So someone with hair down is not saying they're available, they're saying they're too distraught to care about their hair. And certainly in the context of someone who's crying so much that she's raining tears on Jesus' feet, it's hardly a sexual invitation. So there's really nothing to suggest that this woman is a prostitute, and Jesus is never concerned about what kind of sinner she is or what her sins are, and she makes no confession. So the assumption there's something sexually wrong with her at the beginning is, as I say, is just simply sexism. It can't be repeated enough. But that does not mean that there's not an erotic element to the scene here. And of course, one does not follow the other unless one really is sexist. To say that a woman who has some kind of erotic presence is therefore a slut or a prostitute or something wrong with her comes from much later Christian denigration of women's sexuality, not from the Bible and certainly not from Jesus, who never says anything critical of women's sexuality anywhere in the Gospels. So what she is a woman who has much love in her because of the forgiveness she's experienced, which is Jesus' take on it later. So as we start the story, if we read it through the lens that Jesus puts on it rather than the lens that Simon puts on it, maybe we'll hear the story a little more closely. And so let's just look finally at this verse here, 39, before we stop for today. So now that all this happening, the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, and highlighting that this is the one whose house it is and is in charge of it. Notice there's no it in Greek. It just says when he looked. He said to himself, and notice he's talking into himself, and Jesus will respond to the Pharisee's thoughts to himself. And notice again, that's an expression of restraint. He could well have said it out loud. We've seen the Pharisees to Jesus' disciples and others say, "Why are you doing this?" Asking those questions out loud. But note the details of what he says inside himself, noting again the narrator's omniscient perspective that he can know what's inside the Pharisee's heart and head here. If this man were a prophet, So the sentence starts with the assumption that he's not a prophet. Even though the people affirmed him as a prophet when he raised the widow's son from death, and Jesus speaking to the crowd in the last scene, if John was a prophet and more than a prophet, then certainly Jesus falls in that category as well. But notice that if this man, too, is a denigrating word, autos, if this fellow, it's often translated as, or this one, if this guy were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is. Now, if he was a prophet, would he know who this is? There's nothing to suggest that a prophet knows everybody's identity before they show up. So perhaps that's just simply a misunderstanding of the word prophet from a Pharisee, which is a little joke for the audience. But the question of what kind of woman, using the unusual word or patape here, only one other time in Luke, not in my chart because it's a number of times elsewhere. But in other words, what category she falls in. And who is touching him. Notice the double who. Known who and what kind, who is touching him, that she is a sinner. When he's thinking what kind of woman, is he thinking prostitute? Or he doesn't say that. He simply says that she's a sinner. And so the Pharisees' assumption is if Jesus was truly a prophet, he would not let a sinner, a known sinner, be touching him. But as we'll see in the next scene, Jesus interprets the story very differently, and perhaps that's a message to pastors today, whether of the conservative side or the liberal side. Well, that's where we'll pick it up next time. See you then.